Thanks so much for having me here today. It's a real honour. Right then. Now, when most people think about boards, which is what I'm going to talk about tonight, they tend to think of this. Long mahogany table, wooden panelled walls, Chesterfield-style chairs. And then they also tend to think of this as well, quite tragically. The historic sort of upper white middle-class male board, you know, considering decisions, pontificating. And I have to say, when I arrived in London in the sort of like, you know, mid-90s, rise of the consumer internet, let's face it, a precocious little brat. And I found myself on the board of an emerging marketing communications group. It's fair to say that I had sort of a disproportionate ego to talent ratio. Now, I was so ill-equipped to be there, it was ridiculous. At no other point in human history or history of business does a 25-year-old brat redneck from Melbourne make it onto the board of a Marcoms group in London. Now, I didn't know why I was there. I didn't really know what the purpose of a board was, to be honest with you, and I sort of started asking a lot of questions. And I got pointed in the direction of, you know, regulatory frameworks, compliance, you know, corporate governance, independent audits, and all of that was fascinating. And I wouldn't want to in any way, shape or form diminish the necessity or importance of those attributes. But all I really sort of like got out of it in a very crude redneck kind of way was that boards were there to make decisions. And they were there to make primarily decisions around the strategy of the organisation. And that goes for whether it's a publicly listed company, a privately owned company, not-for-profit, a organising body or governing body. They're primarily there to make decisions. So how do they make decisions? And whenever I'm trying to explain to anyone and give them an insight in terms of how boards make decisions, I usually start with two fundamentals. And if you can understand these, I think you go a long way to understanding how boards function. The first is the teachings of eminent psychiatrist Sigmund Freud. And the second, probably slightly less obviously, is the leadership structures of Star Trek. So, let's go to the holy triumvirate that led the Starship Enterprise. Gene Roddenberry, who was the creator of the series, actually based the three main characters and the leadership of the Enterprise on the teachings of Sigmund Freud. Freud posited that the human psyche was based or broken down into three core areas. One was the id, which was the unbridled, passionate part of our character. The second was the superego, which was the cold, clinical, rational, logical part of our character. And then the third was the ego, which was really there as a fulcrum to act between the id and the superego and bring it into balance to make decisions. It's not hard to sort of work out which of the characters sort of like fits into each of those boxes. You've obviously got Captain James T. Kirk. He's the larger-than-life id going out into the universe. You've got the cold, rational, logical Mr. Spock, who is, you know, calculating everything to a 99.2% of probability of failure. And then you've got Dr. Bones McCoy, who's there wanting to bring them both into balance and try and arrive at a particular decision. And if you play that out into most boardrooms in the Western world, it plays out pretty well. You've got the CEO who's sitting there saying, we're going to go boldly beyond where anyone's been before. We've got a CFO who's sitting there sort of saying, yeah, no, but we've only got the money to go to like 5 parsecs, not 12 parsecs. And then you've got a COO who's sitting there trying desperately to balance between the two of those individuals in order to make a decision. Now, actually nothing really has changed that much in board structures since the Industrial Revolution. It sort of started changing a little bit probably about 20 years ago. We saw chief marketing officers being added to the board. We saw chief information officers added to the board. Obviously now we're starting to see chief technology officers in the board, which in my head playing out into the Starship Enterprise means you've got Scotty standing in the engine room going, I'm giving her all she's got, Captain. And that, one of the things that I find really, really interesting about this model is that it's all about diversity. Like, we talk about not having diversity in a boardroom, and yet, bizarrely, we kind of actually have it there without even kind of recognising it. And what we're talking about here really is skill set diversity and mindset diversity, and we appreciate and value that diversity of that flavour. What we talked about here so far is really about the executive board as well. We're talking about skill sets and mindsets that are applicable in roles that are active day to day on the business, under the bonnet, making the business function. The second part of the board for most organisations is the non-executive board. Now that's where you start adding in some really interesting stuff. Now, historically, the non-executive board had two main functions. One was to turn up to the board meeting, and the other was to go to a long boozy lunch after the board meeting. Very important role of the non-executive director. Fortunately, in most cases, that has actually changed in recent years. And in actual fact, non-executive board directors are held to the same level of corporate governance and compliance issues as executive directors. And it's one way in which, particularly in the last 10, 15 years, that we've actually seen an extra layer of diversity added into our boards, in that we're seeing sector diversity. Without a doubt, a lot of the board roles that I've done in the last sort of 4 or 5 years, I've been there specifically because I didn't have expertise in the particular sector that company or organisation was operating in, and so there's an extra layer of independence. So why, oh why, oh why, if we're actually that accepting of diversity and look at diversity as being this positive thing, do we not see other forms of diversity being embraced in the boardroom? I'd like to think that that's really starting to change. It's slow, but it is starting to change. And more specifically, I think the major one that I want to talk about is gender diversity. So why is gender diversity so important for our boardrooms? Well, for a start, women solve problems differently to men. And if you have different ways of solving a problem being discussed in a boardroom, then you're more likely to hit on a lateral solution to the problem than you would if you weren't discussing them at all. The second main point is that women communicate differently to men. In all the boards that I've sat on that have had some level of gender diversity or gender equality, actually they've had been more naturally involved listening, they've been more collaborative, they've been more collegiate, and ultimately, you've considered more options when you've been in the boardroom. The problem you get when you end up with all male boards is that it becomes competitive really, really quickly. It's all about sucking as much oxygen out of the air and proving that you're at the top of the food chain, and you end up with that scenario, which is just ludicrous. Perversely, just as a quick counterpoint, there are a couple of industries, not many that I've come across, where the obverse is true. And actually, if you look at healthcare in the UK, or if you look at public relations or some areas of event management, it's actually really not uncommon to see all female boards. Certainly, I've had a couple of board roles in the last few years where one of the reasons I was there was the fact that I was a bloke. And actually, you end up with the same issue there when you end up with a single-sex board, is that you end up with competitiveness, oxygen being sucked out of the air, trying to prove that you're top of the food chain, you don't end up with the right decisions being made. So the issue that you end up with the apex predator scenario is that the majority of people don't like conflict. No matter what we say about, oh, I'm going to say this and I'm going to say that and I'm going to stand up for this. Actually, in most scenarios, we really don't. We don't like conflict. And the reality is that if we end up with one person in the room, we end up with a scenario that is this, which is groupthink, which is where to keep the harmony, to keep some semblance of unanimity, to avoid conflict, it's just easier. It's just easier just to shut up and agree and let the point go over. And the problem with that is we're not actually ending up considering all of the potential options that are on the table to meet a particular challenge for that business. If we play that out back to the Starship Enterprise, I actually suspect that if Captain James T. Kirk actually had more gender diverse sort of opinions occurring within his leadership sort of group discussions, actually this probably would have occurred a heck of a lot less. And this happened practically every episode, I know. He probably wouldn't have gone in all guns blazing. He'd have probably set phases to stun. He might have had the opportunity to actually negotiate rather than actually end up in chains. Look, it's a bit of a cliche. The business is really hard these days. It's changing so rapidly. The reality is that the businesses that are going to be successful in the years to come are the ones that are going to make the smartest decisions. I don't see how you can possibly make the smartest decisions available if you don't have a diverse board. I suspect in the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, I think we'll look around at the companies that are dominating every single industry in the Western world, and I think we'll be able to point at them and say that, you know, one of the points of commonality is the fact that they have diverse boards. It's the reason why board diversity isn't optional. It's essential. Thanks very much.